Hello, welcome back to Evangelize LA, and I guess you could call this our prime time slot, kind of a little later in the evening. But this is the way we can make it work in our daily lives. And so thank you to Edith for joining again. This is going to be our weekly daily dose of Aquinas. I don't know if that makes sense, right? Weekly daily dose. Um, just if you haven't joined us for this segment before, what we're doing is Edith and I have been reading a little bit of Aquinas. Each our own little parts over the last like 4 months or so now, and so I'm sorry, I'm getting Chris. Chris wants to come on. He's like, "What time's the
Oh,
what time's the live stream?" I'm like, "Right now, buddy."
no.
So we'll see. We'll see if he can join us in a little bit. But so Edith and I have been reading a little bit of Aquinas every day, and so we're getting our daily dose. And then it's coming to be like once a week. We're able to bring together something that really struck us. That has something to do with the culture or with the events happening in the world, and say, "Hey, look, Aquinas has a lot to say to our culture and to our hearts right now." And so we're going to just dive right into it because the thing that really struck me this week was I was reading the question that Aquinas has on love and the cause of love and the cause of joy, and whether or not love is the only cause of joy. And he begins to show a way that sorrow can actually be a cause for joy. And it's such a beautiful little line because it makes me think of this movie quote that came out within the last year. And you might think that something like this: what is grief if not love persevering? Might be something like Shakespeare. It might be something that comes out of some deep part of scripture, or some, as we were just trying to talk about, the onion trad. Somebody who has these more traditional Catholic tendencies and is able to create this art in the secular culture that points to it. But no, it doesn't come from any of those places. It comes from actually the most emotionally advanced artificial intelligence in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Vision. And it was on the hit show WandaVision, kind of near the climax of the whole series, to realize that Wanda, who is a witch of sorts, I know that's a little touchy on a Catholic show like this, but she's a superhero witch, right? And from a comic book, okay? It's okay. And Wanda has this power to control people's minds, and she has created what they call a hex over a town, where she has kind of taken the minds of everybody and kind of created characters in people's own minds so that she can have her own perfect little world after she had lost her love, Vision, who is a super advanced artificial intelligence. And she created this world around her using other people's minds in order to create her own little dream world where she can hide from her grief and not have to actually process it. And she's actually keeping all these people from processing their own grief from the tragedies that they've faced. And so it becomes a show about not necessarily about superpowers and superheroes, but it's actually a beautiful story about how Wanda is processing her own grief. And she has this conversation with Vision that she has kind of brought back to life using her powers in a certain way. And he drops this bomb while they're discussing grief. And he says, "What is grief if not love persevering?" And he's talking about how as a robot, he's always been a robot, and so he's never loved anything so much as to fear loss until now. And he has this beautiful moment of defining what grief is. And what does this have to do with Thomas Aquinas? Well, like I said, as Edith and I have been reading through the beautiful work of the Summa and other homilies and writings about Thomas, I came across this really amazing uh, line where that where he describes how sadness can actually lead towards pleasure. He says right in the Summa that because sadness, as it actually exists, causes pleasure, inasmuch as it brings to mind that which is loved, the absence of which causes sadness. And yet the mere thought of it gives pleasure. And so it's this idea of grief. We have grief because we've loved and we've lost, right? And so there is a certain amount of pleasure of calling to mind what we've loved. And so I just thought that was so powerful to find that in Aquinas and be like, oh my gosh, our minds have been blowing up about this Marvel Cinematic Universe, this comic book TV show line from a script, to realize Aquinas was on this hundreds of years ago. And so, Edith, you found something as well.
I did. It's very similar. It
Yeah.
was about sorrow, the section in the Summa that talks about sorrow. And Thomas was saying how sorrow is incompatible with the joy of charity. Well, because there is no evil in charity. And in another question, Thomas says that evil is a cause for sorrow. So in itself, there can be no sorrow in charity. And Thomas uses Paul's rejoice in the Lord always to back this up. Charity in itself will bring no sorrow or sadness. Conversely, since in this life we are so limited and we can see that our union with God is incomplete, our charity is incomplete, this causes sorrow. This kind of sorrow isn't bad because it compels us to want to have a deeper union with God and to grow in holiness. So that is where the quote fits in. It's the perfect summation of what Thomas is saying here. What is grief, if not love persevering? As long as this sorrow doesn't become something we wallow in, we remain motionless in, then it would be a hindrance instead of a perseverance. Von Balthasar says something like, "You are not a log drifting through a river, you are the river. You are the river. Keep moving. You are movement." And we desire God and we don't possess him fully yet. And charity is willing the good of the other. And if we have charity towards our neighbor too, we will feel sorrow if they don't possess God as we would want them to or as they could. And so sorrow isn't just felt when we don't possess the good, but when our neighbor doesn't have the fullness of the good. And this is like the basis for the hunger of souls that many of the saints felt. This hunger is the desire for others to know Christ. And St. Dominic would tell his brothers, well, if you don't have any sins to weep for, then weep for the sins of others so that they may repent. And we can see that the more people we love, the more our charity will increase, but also the more sorrow we will have. And the only way to avoid sorrow is to avoid love. Christ on the cross, a man of sorrows, right? Christ loved all people of all time and of all creation. And this came with all of the sorrow this love implies. And it's an infinite sorrow, but it was later turned into an infinite joy. And we can try to avoid sorrow by avoiding love. And certainly Satan would want to convince us of this and would prefer that we do this, but he does this through pride and self-centeredness, but that will always be just a false sense of security. So yes, what is grief if not love persevering? Like the woman you're mentioning in Marvel, the only way not to have sorrow is to not love, and that is hell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you have me thinking about our sorrowful mother standing at the foot of the cross. And I always think about and pray over that moment where she's standing there at the foot of the cross. And I don't know, sometimes we might have this image of Mary standing at the foot of the cross, being given to John, the beloved disciple, at that moment. Jesus is recreating his family and thinking that maybe she's just standing there like, yeah, okay, I know, this is how it's supposed to go. And there's no grief, there's no sorrow in Our Lady. But I think I really believe that she would actually be feeling sorrow like no one has ever felt sorrow at that moment. There's the beautiful tradition of the church that Our Lady did not feel any pain at the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem, but rather the birth pangs came at the moment of the standing at the foot of the cross, where she was helping Jesus in a certain way give birth to the church, that we became her children at that moment when John received her and when she received John. But also that in her sinlessness, she would have loved so perfectly that in her love, she would have felt that grief and that sorrow of watching her son die even more perfectly, because our sin is something that hides us within ourselves, and we don't feel the grief of others because of our own selfishness that comes with our sin. But Our Lady, being sinless, standing at the foot of the cross, would have felt the pain and the sorrow of the crucifixion more deeply than anyone else standing there besides Jesus himself. And that's not something that ended at the foot of the cross. You mentioned like the saints and their desire for souls. and that doesn't end when they get to heaven, right? Their intercession for us is felt even more deeply because of their perfection. They're being made perfect in heaven. That so many times, like you have apparitions of Our Lady, and she reveals her sorrowful heart to somebody, or she appears and she's crying. And we've always been taught and believed, oh, there's no tears in heaven. There's no crying in heaven. There'll be perfect joy. But then that reveals to us that Mary still has a great desire that all of her children be in heaven, and that there are those who are turning away because of their sinfulness, because of their doubt, that brings grief to her sorrowful heart. Even though it's experiencing some kind of perfection in heaven, that there is still that, that heavenly and saintly grief that we can pray over. I don't know. I don't it's all speculation at this
Exactly.
point.
Exactly. It's all a mystery because God didn't have to make any of this. He didn't have to create anything. He didn't have to create us, and he did. But along with love comes sorrow, and that's sorrow for God as well because we're not corresponding to him, and he's the lover that comes and looks for us and does not get a response. And that's a mystery too. So how does that work? I'm not sure. But can I talk about Christ more?
Oh, of course, please. That's what we're here for.
Can we talk about Christ? um, his going out from the Father, I think it was, yes, it was Balthazar who I'm you're a big Marvel fan. Well, I'm a Balthazar fan. His going out from the Father in perfect obedience didn't make it any less difficult or sorrowful for him. Like I mentioned, he is the man of sorrows. That's what we hear on Good Friday in Isaiah. He's the man of sorrows, and especially on the cross. And Christ's entire life was one of sorrow. And von Balthasar has a beautiful line in his book, Heart of the World, and it's buried in an even more beautiful passage. So everybody go read that book. The going out itself is love, and the going out itself is the return. So what that means is that Christ, by going out of the Father, already manifests his love, but his journey, his going out, is already the return. And every step he took was the return, but the return was with us. And the ultimate step was the cross. It was the moment when he seemed to be the furthest away from the Father. So, what is grief? What was Christ's life if not love persevering? Then Balthazar applies this to us and to the way we respond to the Great Commission of going out and making disciples of all nations. As the Father sent me, well, I send you. That's what Christ says to us. So our mission will resemble Christ's mission also. And that means it will have its sorrows, but this path of sorrows we walk is love persevering. And it's a beautiful image because, yes, this is a valley of tears, as we say in the Salve Regina. And we cannot give up hope. I think hope is the great cure for sorrow. We have sorrow because we desire something that we don't yet have. That's basic. That's the underlying principle. We desire something that we don't have. But if we center ourselves in that something we don't have and how hard it is to attain, and we don't have trust, we fall into hopelessness. We fall into hopelessness. So Thomas says that hope is desiring something that, even though it's hard to attain, you trust that it's still possible to attain. And I think it's so easy to fall into hopelessness nowadays over anything, over your own life, over the things you see happening in the world. This kind of connects to how what we were saying in the last episode, I guess, about evil, hopelessness over the state of the world, hopelessness over the state of the church, hopelessness in my own life. I think the people who know me know that I always tell them, pray for hope, pray for an increase in the virtue of hope, because oftentimes our sadness, our sorrow is ultimately a lack of hope. But it is feeling the desire for God, knowing that even though it's difficult, holiness is attainable. And the New Testament says Christ is our hope. anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to add, you know,
I
like
know.
the, yeah. Um, my first thought is like St. Paul writing to the Thessalonians. You can find it right
Yeah.
there in chapter 4. I think it's like verse 13, where he's talking about those who've died. You know, I don't want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, of those who've fallen asleep, so that you might not
Yeah.
grieve as the rest of the world does, who has no hope. and and you
Hmm.
know, I read that at funerals all the time, and so it just really strikes me when people are grieving the loss of a loved one. I tell them it's okay to grieve. St. Paul is not telling you that you can't grieve at all. You know, he
Hmm.
grieves throughout his life. You know, St. Paul, you know, he is so conformed to the image of Christ that he is a man of grief and sorrow as well in this life. But that he says that you might not grieve as the rest of the world does, as the rest who have no hope. And so our hope changes the way that we grieve. Our hope makes that, you know, our grief into something that is love, persevering. And so that's the first thing that I think of with St. Paul, is that, you know, he's not saying don't grieve at all, but he's saying, you
Hmm.
know, you're going to grieve like Christ grieved, you know. And so somebody who's conformed to the image of Christ becomes a person of the Beatitudes. Then, right? That's the next thought I have, and I think we've talked about this before too. Is
Yeah, a
the
little.
idea? Yeah, Ratzinger describes it as, you know, the Beatitudes are the inner spiritual biography of Jesus, is so that when you live out the Beatitudes, you are living out Christ's inner life. You know, those who mourn and those who weep, and the meek, and the poor in spirit, those who are persecuted for the, you know, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, the peacemakers, the merciful, the clean of heart, and those who are persecuted for righteousness. You know, those all describe who Jesus is. And when we enter into those things, they're not good in themselves. Like, they involve grief. Every last one of them involves grief. You know, poverty is not always a pleasant experience, right? And you know, mourning and being meek, and having to be merciful means somebody's hurt you, and you have to be merciful to them. You know,
Yeah.
and to be a peacemaker means there's war, and that you go into that war to make peace. So every one of these is, in some sense, a moment of grief that Jesus is inviting us into a new way of life, into His way of life. Um, and so, kind of the last thing I'm thinking of also is, along with how St. Paul says we grieve, but differently than the rest of the world, and that's because we are people of the Beatitudes. We have Jesus' own inner life within ourselves, and that can be seen in both Mary and Joseph, in the Holy Family. And so I love to think that, you know, a lot of, you know, some of the things that Jesus taught and some of the ways that he acted, I think he learned in a certain sense from Mary and Joseph, and from their experience as a Holy Family. And so you look at the both the sorrows of Our Lady and the sorrows of Saint Joseph are all intimately tied to the joys in their lives as well. I mean, just a few examples. You think of, you know, Joseph having to take his family down to Bethlehem, you know, well,
Hmm.
taking his wife down to Bethlehem while she's pregnant, and then giving birth in a town that was not their home at the time, and then having to go off to Egypt at a certain point, and to take his family as refugees away from Herod, who was trying to kill all of the children. So these are tremendous sorrows in Joseph's life. But then he also has the joy of being able to hold God incarnate in his arms at the birth. And then the pleasure of serving Jesus and Mary as they travel down into Egypt. Like, these were joys that came out of sorrows. And so we have a very different experience as Christians with with the experience of sorrow, with grief, with loss, and with death. We have a very different relationship with death than does the rest of the world, because of hope, as you mentioned. You know, that the hope
Hmm.
that we receive from Christ. Yeah.
I like that you mentioned that one of the great joys of Saint Joseph was the serving the Holy
Mm,
Family, as in the rest of the Holy Family, Jesus and Mary, because we can talk about sorrow a lot in terms of what St. Thomas said, but he mentions the remedies for sorrow. And one of those remedies is, well, do something you find pleasure in.
mm,
And you were mentioning this yesterday too. So everything just sort of comes together. Pleasure can be, of course, listening to music, maybe going for a walk, doing something you enjoy, finding pleasure in something that's just morally good, not finding pleasure in something morally evil, of course. But the greatest pleasure is serving somebody else. and doing good for somebody else. And that is exemplified in St. Joseph. So when you feel sorrowful, come out of yourself. Sometimes that's what it takes. Come out of yourself and give of yourself. Know that you do have something to give. And I always find that to be true. Always find that to be true, that when I'm trying to deal with my own sorrow by myself, it's not as effective as when I come out of myself and just expose myself to somebody else and open myself up to somebody else and give of myself to that person also.
Yeah, that's where our true identity is found, right? There's so
Mm-hmm.
many different ways that people are finding their identities in our culture today, but the church has taught, has always taught that our identity is found in the love of God, which is this self outpouring love, so that we will only be able to truly find ourselves when we give ourselves away in love. And by that giving away, there can be a certain grief, whether or not people are ready to receive our love, whether or not we're able to love as well as we want to and God wants to. So we'll continue to reflect on these powerful words that come from Marvel. I think we've established that maybe you're a bigger fan of Aquinas than I am of Marvel, so but
Yes.
that's okay. Yeah, that's a better thing. So thank you so much for joining this evening, and just getting a chance to dive a little bit into my world as well of Marvel,
Thank you
and
for sharing that.
the
That was a
things that you
really
experienced.
amazing quote. It was so good.
Yeah,
It just
yeah.
fit perfectly and allowed us to talk about all these different things that it just doesn't end.
Yeah. But it's so rich, and so we continue to ask the intercession of our sorrowful mother as well. That we know that her sorrows were not the end of the story, and never will be, and that there are always greater joys coming from the hope that we have as Christians and as Catholics. So, Edith, thank you for joining tonight, and
Mhm.
we look forward to next week another chance to chat a little bit more about our daily dose of Aquinas.
Sure.
All right,
Thank
God,
you.
yeah, sure thing. God bless you all.